Folks coming in from the waiting room and joining with audio, welcome to the Centralina Regional Recovery Summit. We're so excited to have you with us this morning. I want to thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules to participate with us. I'm Geraldine Gardner, the Executive Director of the Centralina Regional Council. We're a regional organization serving the 9 counties of the Greater Charlotte metro area. We lead regional collaboration and spark local action in order to improve the quality of life in our communities and expand opportunity for our constituents. Today, we're here to learn and listen to each other in our pursuit of developing a resilient whole community framework for recovery. We know that natural and man-made disruptions will continue to emerge, threatening the health and safety and economic vibrancy of our communities and impacting our residents in very personal ways. But how can we recover from these disruptions in a way that moves our communities forward and leverages the unique strengths of government and non-government partners? Our Regional Resilience Collaborative is shaped by our county emergency managers. It's designed to grow regional recovery relationships and build upon information, education, collaboration, and community partner support. I want to thank all of our 9 county emergency managers, their teams, and our county and city managers for your active participation in the collaborative so far. It's great to see some of your faces today in the Zoom room. This summit is the first in a series of intensive engagements to share valuable recovery planning information, build upon strong regional relationships that already exist, and help you create resilient recovery plans in your counties. We're delighted to have our community partners in the room today to help create a whole community recovery dialogue in your counties. And we're also excited that this summit has drawn interest from leaders from as far away as Canada and Missouri. We hope you take away some insights for your communities and invite you to stay in touch with us. And finally, a resilient recovery requires a whole of government approach. So we're grateful to have our partners from NCORE, NC Department of Public Safety, as well as our project sponsor, the U.S. Economic Development Administration. And you'll hear from those leaders in just a moment. We have an equally dynamic team leading this work. And I think we have a slide. We could start the slideshow and share your screen. There we go. So I just want to recognize our team and highlight them for their work and leadership on this project. First is Christina Danis, our Assistant Director for Community Economic Development and the project manager for this work. Connor Choka, our Community Economic Development Resilience Analyst. If you have any technical issues during the Zoom call today, please message Connor. And of course, our valuable technical partners at IEM, Megan Aminto, who's a recovery planner, and Lee Zelowitz, who's an emergency management planner. So we're really excited to get started, and I'm going to turn it over to Christina to walk you through the agenda and introduce our first speakers. Thank you and welcome.
Thanks, Geraldine. Thanks everybody for joining today. And I do want to let you know that we had this up there quickly, but we are live tweeting today this event and promoting it on social media as well. And so we are at We Are Centralina, or hashtag, there it is. Thanks, Connor. Thanks, Lee. Those are, so if you are amongst us and you'd like to join that and share this, go ahead and free to use those acronyms for Twitter and Instagram. So let's go and start off with our agenda. First of all, we're really excited about the summit and pulling it together. And this sort of, as Geraldine indicated, gelled from the interest of our 9 county EM leads and what they wanted most. They were really already very collaborative on working on responses and working together in the Centralina region, and really felt that that recovery was where they really wanted to head. So I'm going to tell you that the summit design builds from the keynotes to the panel discussion to the 4 recovery planning themes, which all of you will automatically be placed into a breakout room that will happen at some point, and you will wind up there with your partners. And then the 9 counties will get a chance to debrief together and their own counties. And then the main session, there'll be a social networking that will bring us to a noon closure, which we are destined to do on time. So what I'd like to say is cameras on. We want this to be a live event and interactive, so we want your cameras on. we want your thinking and creativity on as you move through the event. Please use the chat for questions or any concerns that you may have. And during the, right up until the panel sessions or when asked for questions, could you please mute yourself so that we can give full attention to our presenters and make sure that they have a quiet space to share their information and knowledge with us in. So cameras on, thinking caps on, use the chat for Q&A. Make sure you're muted until it's time to speak. And please know that all of this is being recorded, and all of the slides will be shared with all of the participants and those who are interested at the end of the event. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Megamento from IEM to take us through a group activity. Thanks.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. And as Christina mentioned, we're going to do a group activity quickly because we want to know who's in our virtual room today. So we're going to use a tool called Mentimeter. If you could please pull your phones out and open your phone browser. Go to menti.com. It's on the screen here, menti.com. And enter the code that's shown on the screen as well. It's 2859-6249. So I'll give you a minute to get your phones out and get all set up. So I'm going to move to our first question. And if you are still getting set up, you'll see that the URL and the code are at the top of the screen here if you're still getting into Mentimeter on your phone. But the first question we're asking is, what type of organization do you represent? Are you with local government, state or federal government? Are you with a nonprofit or a private sector partner? Okay, great. Well, it looks like we have a mix, a lot of local government, and I think it'll be a great opportunity to share among these different sectors. So we look forward to a robust discussion today. And I'm going to move to the next question. Just let a couple more people answer. Okay, so our next question then is, what level of experience do you have working on recovery? So self-assessment, we imagine there's people here with different levels of expertise and experience. So we just want to get a pulse on the room and see where you guys are. Okay, great. It looks like we have sort of a good mix. So we're all here to learn today. And I think we've got a great group. So thank you all for joining. Before we move to our speakers, we just want to review a couple key concepts and terms to set the stage for our discussions. And for those experts and those that have lots of experience, this might be a review. You might already know this, but for those who might be new to recovery, we just want to make sure that everybody is starting with some of the same level of understanding. So our event today is going to focus on long-term recovery and resilience. And these are the three different phases that when we think of an event and after an event, it starts with response. So in the hours, days, and possibly weeks after a disaster, the primary objective is life safety. So first responders are going to be working to get everyone safe and out of harm's way, and disaster survivors might need things like shelter and food and emergency medical care. But when we move into the weeks and months, the focus shifts to making sure the area is safe to get back into, the people are able to access their homes if they're able to get back in their homes. So there's a lot of clearing of debris, possibly restoring utilities like power and water, reopening essential businesses like grocery stores or gas stations, and making sure that people have what they need, stuff like temporary housing that's safe and secure. But what we're focused on today is the long-term recovery and resilience piece, and looking at those months to years after a disaster. So how are we essentially rebuilding our communities to a better future? And we want to acknowledge, communities will have different needs and priorities based on the disaster. And there's, big cities, small cities, rural and urban, everyone will have different priorities. They'll have different resources, and some might have larger impacts than others. So everyone's going to have different challenges, and the more we can sort of prepare ahead of time and think through how to solve those challenges, the better off we'll all be. And when we talk about using recovery as an opportunity to build resilience and advance equity, I want to acknowledge that it's not just infrastructure, the way that we think of hardening our roads or bridges and making sure that they can withstand future disasters. We also want to build resilience in our economy. So how do we support our businesses and our workers so that we can get back to work and bounce back quickly after a disaster? And how do we prepare our community, the individuals and families that might need help after a disaster? And then also in terms of advancing equity, we want to make sure that as we think through resource allocation decisions during recovery, that we're understanding what communities have the greatest need, that have disproportionate impacts, and that the resources that are available reach those individuals. Because a lot of them and those communities will have been under-resourced ahead of time. So the last thing I'll say to kind of echo what Geraldine talked about is that pre-disaster planning and what we're doing today also focuses on strengthening partnerships. So it's critical that we get to know each other, get to build those relationships, understand what other organizations might be doing to support long-term recovery. We're lucky today to have a diverse group of stakeholders here. So we look forward to the discussions that we'll have during our breakout groups, and hopefully you'll get to meet some partners that you haven't had the opportunity to talk with yet. So with that, I'm going to hand it back over to Christina to introduce our speakers.
Thanks, Meg. I appreciate that. And clearly, building on the term of partnerships, it is my great honor to introduce Hillary Sherman. She's the North Carolina Economic Development Representative for the U.S. Department of Commerce Economic Development Administration. And in this capacity, Hillary works with communities across the state to develop and implement economic development projects. The Centralina Regional Resilience Collaborative Project is funded via an EDA special need project due to the presidentially declared disasters of Hurricane Florence and Michael. The project is part of the EDA Recovery and Resilience from Natural and Economic Shocks investment area. Our North Carolina partners certainly know Hillary and are aware of how incredibly responsive and supportive she is to the economic resiliency of North Carolina. For our new partners, I want to add a tidbit that she resides in Asheville, North Carolina, and that she is an AmeriCorps Vista member. Hillary knows every community is unique. In her interview with Virginia Tech, I wanted to lift up something that I thought really reflects where we are today. One of the things she is most excited and loves about EDA is the ability to really work with partners in the field to make customized solutions and create partnerships that bring up locally developed ideas and strategies that respond to individual and unique needs. And I think that reflects our work here today and the support from Hillary. So welcome, Hillary, and thanks for sharing your time with all of us today.
Thank you so much. It's so great to be here with you and Centralina at this Resilience Summit. I want to give a kind of a special shout out to Centralina and Christine, to you and Geraldine and Connor for your work organizing this event and just your ongoing work to promote resilience across the entire Centralina region. Today's discussion on resilience is really imperative. We have seen and know that being ready and responding for disasters has always been an important focus for emergency management professionals. But the risks faced by communities are broader than just natural disasters. And the horizon to recover is longer than just the recovery period. We see today the risks of dislocation from loss of employment due to increased automation, increased technology usage and AI, and changing supply chains and business patterns. And communities need to be prepared for that. We see increased risks from floods, landslides, climate change, hurricanes, and tornadoes, and communities have to be prepared for that. And unfortunately, as the last year and a half has laid bare, we see health risks, and communities too have to be prepared for that. So building resilience takes everyone. It takes economic developers, workforce developers, business leaders, universities, community organizations, elected officials, and importantly, the public at large. It takes a multidimensional understanding and collaboration. And we all know this. It's not necessarily how things are necessarily structured, but we see this every day. We know that having access to transportation networks implicitly impacts housing availability and cost. And we know that both transportation and housing impacts the location of businesses and ultimately has impacts on jobs. So building resilience in this collaborative way where everybody's involved is also about promoting equity. It's about understanding the vulnerabilities that different communities faced and the interrelationships that the challenges of some of these issues and community components are facing, and understanding the decisions and the actions that can influence these vulnerabilities, and promoting structures in which those conversations can be cultivated and improved. Promoting equity really requires all of us to work broadly to promote resilience. At EDA, we're committed to supporting communities and advancing economic development efforts that really advance equity and resilience. Today's discussion is a really important step forward in advancing this effort. We're looking forward to seeing how this is going to complement the important work that Centralina leads with a comprehensive economic development strategy, and how this can complement the ongoing work of hazard mitigation planning, local comp planning, and local resilience planning. It's a pleasure to be here. I look forward to a great discussion, and EDA is always engaging and continuing the great partnership that we have with Centralina. So let's have a great summit, and I look forward to the great discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Hillary. And we look forward to making those connections as well with the SEDS and hazard mitigation plans with our 9 counties and beyond. And thanks for your support. Next, I'd like to introduce Laura Hogshead. And hi, Laura. Laura is a native North Carolinian, and she's the Chief Operating Officer for the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resilience, NCORE. She served as the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development HUD Chief Operating Officer from 2013 to 2017, and the U.S. House Representative Appropriations Committee from 2007 to 2013. Currently, Laura oversees the expenditure of hurricane recovery funds from HUD for areas hit by Hurricanes Matthew and Florence. She also oversees the expenditure of U.S. Department of Treasury Coronavirus Relief Fund and emergency rental assistance allocations through the state's pandemic-related emergency rental assistance program. We're very grateful for Laura to give some time to us today, and a lot of stuff that's going on, not North Carolina, but also across the nation, to share with us her insight about recovery and resilience and the importance of partnerships and equity. Thank you, Laura.
So thank you very much. It's an honor to be here this morning. I'm really grateful to be asked to do this. And I'm going to say that as someone who lived through Hurricane Hugo in Mecklenburg County and went to school in Union County, I'm particularly glad to see all the counties that I grew up in and around participating in this kind of effort. It's a really wonderful way to get started. And I'm not going to say anything that is tremendously revolutionary this morning, but I do want to start with, this is the right thing to be doing, right? You all are doing the right thing at the right time. And I'm so impressed that you've pulled together to do this in a time that, while we are dealing with a crisis, you are not dealing with a natural disaster right now. So now's the right time to plan. And so I'm so impressed that you're doing this. And I want to just take a few minutes to talk about what we've learned. And so I'll give a disclaimer here, right? I didn't see any of my bosses on the agenda, plenty of my colleagues on the agenda. I'm going to talk about how we have learned some hard lessons in North Carolina. I'm not blaming anybody, right? When you know better, you do better, and we're at the do better phase. So I want to talk about where we've come from and what we've learned from those experiences. So if you'll indulge me for a second, 5 years ago today, right? 5 years ago today, North Carolina had not had a shocking, massive storm since Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And so we were a little out of practice. And while there were lots of smaller disasters going on every year, all the time, that you all were dealing with, that others were dealing with, there wasn't anything that had risen to the level of horror that it would get a congressional appropriation since around the early 2000s. So while FEMA always steps in and while there is always disaster response, there was never HUD money coming into North Carolina, not since 1999 and 2004 had the state of North Carolina received what's called CDBG-DR funds. And everyone's familiar with CDBG, right? Community Development Block Grant. But the state had not received Community Development Block Grant disaster recovery funds, which is a special flavor of CDBG, since 2004. So again, 5 years ago today, the state is sitting in a place where we hadn't had to do this on a large scale in quite a long time. So 2004, 1999, if it's 2016, maybe we had gotten a little out of practice. So then in October, Hurricane Matthew hits. And immediately the state did what I've seen every state do from my time in Washington. I've seen every state do this after a major disaster. They got an appropriation from Congress, they pushed it to the counties. That is the absolute instinctual thing to do. Get some money from Congress, push it to the counties. North Carolina is an incredibly county-centric place, and that's a wonderful thing. But to push that amount of money to the county level is just something that I've seen every state do, and then at some point, every state reassesses that because the counties start saying, hang on, this is not quite fair. So imagine, again, 5 years, Hurricane Matthew. The state gets $236 million to do long-term recovery. That's what CDBG-DR does, is the very long-term recovery. So after SBA, after FEMA have done what they can do, CDBG-DR funds come in to support that final piece of recovery for people who have not been able to recover using other sources. So the state chugs along. The state gives that money to the counties, signs agreements with the counties, says, best of luck to you, and some work starts. 22 months later, so now we're 3 years ago today, we start watching this storm called Florence and wondering if it's going to impact North Carolina. And then it hits on September 14th, 2018. And then it gets really serious because it becomes apparent that there is going to be more money coming to the state to do long-term disaster recovery. And it wasn't going very well, right? I will be honest, it wasn't going very well. The Hurricane Matthew money wasn't being spent very fast. Folks were out of practice. No one quite knew what to do with that money. And there's more to come, right? So $500 and some million was coming for Hurricane Florence. And that's when the legislature and the governor decided to stand up this office to shepherd that recovery. And so I feel like we have been we've only been in existence for 3 years, but I feel like we've gotten a front row seat to how to change course. And so what I want to tell you this morning is all the lessons that we've learned the hard way as a state and as an office so that you can skip that part, right? You can skip right to the good part. And so I will say, the thing that you're doing right now, the gathering this morning is the first right thing. You have to work regionally. When we got the money for Hurricane Florence, we changed course and we didn't push it out to the counties. We asked the counties what they needed and had them tell us what they needed, and then figured out a way to not reinvent the wheel 50 times over because 50 counties were involved. We decided to take on the onus of all of the burdensome stuff at the state level. So all of the compliance, all of the talking to HUD, all of the action plan writing, all of the SCUT work, we decided needed to be the state's responsibility. And the local communities needed to tell us what they needed, and the state's responsibility was to help them get there. So you all know better than anyone in Raleigh what your community needs. That's where we need you to focus. And then you don't need to be worried about the procurement rules because that's where we should be worried. And so a different partnership developed where we weren't just pushing out money like you do with CDBG, right? You get some money for a library, you get some money for sidewalks, and that's great. But when what you're talking about is not $750,000 a year, it's 20, 30, 40, $50 million all at once, that's too much to absorb. And that's too much to ask county by county for everyone to figure out, right? Figure it out for your county. Because as you all already know, what happens upstream affects downstream. What your neighbor county does affects you tremendously. So you can't make these decisions at the county level. You have to work together to make the best decision for the region. Because if you don't, we're going to be hardening ourselves against each other, right? We're going to be building infrastructure to stave off what our neighboring county did. And that is not resilience, right? That's defensive. Resilience is what you all are doing, is coming together, having the conversation in blue sky times, even though it's a very rainy morning, having the conversation now to figure out what it is that this community needs, this larger community needs to be healthy, and how we would use the dollars that inevitably come after a major disaster to advance those goals. So that's where you all are right now. So step one, you're already there. You're talking, you're developing the relationships, you're strengthening the relationships, you are thinking regionally. And I think that has been one of the bigger lessons for Eastern North Carolina coming out of Matthew and Florence. You just can't do this county by county because the storm, the pandemic, whatever you're dealing with doesn't respect county lines. And we all are interdependent on each other. I think the pandemic has raised that more than most things. We are dependent on each other, and so we have to talk to each other about what the solution is. So that's step number one, work regionally. You're already there. Step number two, you're doing this at the right time. So with the funding that is coming from the American Rescue Plan, I have never seen such a federal investment that is this flexible. I've never seen this much money that has this few strings attached to it. So while I hope that there is never a disaster that earns you CDBG-DR money, because that means something really horrific happened, you have better money at your disposal. You have ARP money, and hopefully soon you'll have infrastructure money that is so flexible and designed to be put to use very quickly. You have the best source of funding right now at your disposal. And so the question is, how do you work together to target that funding where it needs to go? And so what are your needs? That's the conversation that you're starting this morning, or maybe you've already started. But what are the needs? What do you actually need to recover? And I like that you all put up the graphic about what this morning is focused on, the long-term recovery, because the response is going to be fine. The response is going to happen because you all know exactly what to do in response. That you could do in your sleep, and you likely will be doing it at 2 a.m. if you have a disaster. The short-term recovery, you've got that too, right? That is when everybody kicks into gear, FEMA gets on the ground, everybody's all hands on deck. The longer term recovery, the real slog, the months and the years and waiting several years for something to come to fruition, that is the harder part, and that's the more critical part to think about before something happens. So you all are thinking about that now. And I will say, you know, we talk with Hillary all the time, we talk with FEMA all the time, we talk with HUD all the time. Those agencies don't talk to each other very much. So I'm saying this as someone who worked in DC for a very long time. Those agencies are going to come in and they're going to do what they do. And they are going to hope that you all are knitting together that fabric, because they are not able to speak the same language, right? They all exist in DC, they exist just a few blocks from each other, but having been there, they don't talk enough. And they're not allowed to talk enough. This isn't for lack of will. They have different appropriations strings, they have different authorizing legislation, they don't speak the same language. So when FEMA and SBA and HUD come to town, they don't know each other, not really. And their programs don't work together, not really. And so it's incumbent on the state and on the local government to figure out how to knit those programs together. And that's where I feel like the state has started to take a stronger hand, is to make sure that we are helping advise on how you get FEMA and HUD to work together, how you combine funding sources, how you get creative about what you saw someone do in Louisiana, or what you heard about after Hurricane Sandy, or what's going on in Puerto Rico. So how do we take some of those lessons learned? Because other people are fighting these same battles and other people are getting some yeses, right? So if you can point to a yes in another state and say, well, that project involved FEMA and HUD and EDA and they pulled it off, talk to them, right? Because once it's done once, the federal government can't say it can't be done. right? So look for those examples of things that are happening other places. But I would say the opportunity that you have right now with those American Rescue Plan dollars is tremendous. So that's lesson number 2. You are doing this at the right time. There is a lot of money falling from the sky. And my encouragement to you all is to think creatively about how to use that money and to think about it from an equity lens. So that's number 3. And there's only 3. So I promise I'll stop soon. When you have a disaster, and we all know it always falls hardest on low-income populations. The disaster always disproportionately affects the folks who are struggling the most to begin with. And so what we have seen, and what I would encourage you all to think about, is that you have to meet people where they are. It is absolutely insane to me that we ask low-income people to take a check from FEMA and hang on to it for a few years while we wait for HUD to show up, because it does take a few years for HUD to show up. And not to spend that money, but to save it so that they can combine it with the HUD funds and not cause a duplication of benefits. That's the dreaded phrase, right? Duplication of benefits. The federal government can't pay twice for any activity. So if I go through a storm and FEMA gives me $10,000 to repair my roof, and then later HUD comes in and says, I'm gonna actually do your whole first floor, I'm supposed to cough up that $10,000 because that's money that the government gave me for a purpose. That is not realistic. If I'm a low-income person who is struggling before the storm, I'm gonna take that $10,000, I'm gonna replace my car, I'm gonna buy food, I'm gonna survive the storm or the pandemic or whatever is going on. And so years later, when someone else comes to the table and says, I can help you, but you need to give us that first money as part of the project, that's not realistic. So understand from the beginning that that is not how this can work. And so one way that we have worked through that here is to supplement the federal funds with local funds and with charitable funds. So I'll give an example. Catholic Charities offered us $150,000 to supplement those FEMA dollars that people had already spent. So again, if I've gone through a storm, I got $10,000 for my roof, but I used it to replace my car, which was flooded out. And now I don't have that $10,000, so I can't avail myself of the full home reconstruction. That partnership with Catholic Charities, my DOB is $10,000. Catholic Charities is giving that money, granting that money to some of our recipients so that they can unlock the $150,000 award from HUD. And so that $150,000 has unlocked $5.3 million worth of reconstruction on homes. And that is something that I want folks to think about from the beginning. There is going to be a really important role for the private charities, for private sector, for state and local funds to supplement those federal funds, because the federal funds don't work very well together and there's always going to be a gap. It's often not a huge gap, right? It's $10,000 or $5,000 or $2,000. We have people who can't avail themselves of the reconstruction of their home for what we call it an escrow, for an escrow of $500, right? They can't come up with $500 that would unlock the entire award because they spent that 5 years ago. So what I would say is please meet people where they are, understand that people are going to make decisions that are best for them in that moment. And that may mean that you need to come in with some creative funding sources towards the end to help them avail themselves of the opportunities that might come with the federal funding. So I think you're doing this at the right time. I think you've got a lot of discretionary dollars to think about doing this with. And I would encourage you to be mindful always of what your folks are going through. Short term, I know that that's top of mind. Medium term, I know it's top of mind. Long term, that seems to get a little lost because people feel like, well, you know, everybody moved on. Everybody doesn't move on. Some people get stuck for a very long time. And so I would encourage you to think about that from the beginning. Who are the folks that are living in the floodplain, or God forbid, the floodway? Because mostly what we're talking about in North Carolina is hurricanes and flooding. Who are the folks that we need to think about moving? Who are the folks that we need to think about getting out of harm's way? Someone said to me early in this job, the best swiftwater rescue is the one you didn't have to do. And that stuck with me, because if you can get people out of harm's way, then your job as emergency managers becomes a whole lot easier. And that's what Director Sprayberry used to tell us all the time. Get folks out of harm's way. I can't keep rescuing the same folks over and over again. It's breaking my heart. And so we try to live by that, get people out of harm's way, get them to higher ground, get them to a better economic and educational situation so that they can survive that next storm without depending on HUD and FEMA, so that they can get the private insurance or they can move forward with their lives and not worry every time it rains, because we still have folks who worry every single time it rains. And I know you know that. I know you've got good examples. I know Mecklenburg County is doing a lot of buyouts and a lot of moving of folks, but think about what's going to happen in the long term right now. So you take Haywood County as an example. The response was great. The response was heroic. But once people's homes are gone and there's no affordable housing there, where are they going to go? So think about that now, because it's really hard to keep that perspective in the very short-term immediate crisis. So again, you're doing the right things, think regionally, use the funding sources that are coming to us as a once in a lifetime experience now, and meet people where they are. Recognize that folks are going to be suffering before the storm, during the storm, after the storm, or replace storm with pandemic, replace storm with whatever the situation is. Think about them now so that you can potentially get them out of harm's way and save yourselves a lot of work and a lot of worry down the road. So again, thank you for the opportunity. I hope that was helpful, and I look forward to hearing from the rest of you. So thanks a lot.
Thank you, Laura. And thanks for taking the risk and being honest and authentic with us about how to connect those dollars and about what they mean to North Carolina and others. And we're really excited about the work of NCORE and partnering together with EDA and FEMA and making sure that those partnerships do leverage. And I think that equity lens that you spoke of is going to be lifted up in the panel that's coming up in this panel discussion. So I'm really excited about that. And I want to introduce Lee Zelowicz from IEM to introduce our panel and take us into that discussion. Thanks, Lee.
Great, thank you, Christina. Today we bring together a panel of individuals with direct experience in long-term recovery and different experiences, expertise, and perspectives to share with all of you. Our first panelist is Dr. Dawn Baldwin-Gibson. She is the Executive Director of the Pelota Institute for Building Resilient Communities, the founding chairperson of the Pamlico County Disaster Recovery Coalition, co-chair of the North Carolina Inclusive Disaster Recovery Network's African American Council, and she was the Emotional and Spiritual Care Task Force chairperson for the North Carolina Voluntary Organizations Active in Disasters. Our second panelist is Joe Stanton, and Joe has more than 25 years of experience with disaster recovery, including work on 35 federal and 40 state disaster declarations. Joe has been with the North Carolina Department of Public Safety's Division of Emergency Management for 18 years and currently serves as Recovery's Program Delivery Chief. Our third panelist is Jane Cage. Jane is an experienced community leader and entrepreneur focused on long-term recovery. Jane serves as the principal for Insight 522, a firm focused on long-term community recovery and resilience. Jane served as the chairman of the Joplin Citizens Advisory Recovery Team, a citizen-led group of over 100 community leaders tasked with developing long-term recovery efforts for Joplin, Missouri after the 2011 tornado disaster. Our final panelist is Dr. Amanda Martin, and Dr. Martin is the Chief Resilience Officer for the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency. Previously, Dr. Martin oversaw the Southeast Disaster Recovery Partnerships, where she implemented capacity building and built a network of recovery and resilience professionals across the Southeast and Caribbean. Dr. Martin also served as a principal planner for the state of Rhode Island with a focus on climate change adaptation planning, demographic analysis, and community engagement with underrepresented populations. That's a mouthful. So before we jump into some questions for our panelists, each panelist is going to provide 3 lessons learned regarding their disaster recovery experience that's kind of unique in their area of expertise. So I'm going to hand it over now. I believe Dawn is up first.
Good morning. Thank you so very much for allowing our perspective in this very important conversation, and to what Laura Hogshead has just said. Thank you for your comments, because they are extremely important, especially as we're talking about vulnerable communities. And so just to give some insight about this work that we come to for doing this work, I would say that I would premise all of my comments on the concept that we've learned, and that is whatever is in the community at the time of the disaster, it is only amplified by the disaster. And so if you're dealing with low wealth communities, it's going to be amplified. If you're dealing with joblessness, it's going to be amplified. If you're dealing with challenges around affordable housing, it's going to be amplified. And so that is why this coming together is so vitally important. And so the three lessons that I would lift up is, first and foremost, it is necessary to build infrastructures of resiliency in all communities. And so Eastern North Carolina is my home. My family has been here for more than 300 years. It is home. And so, you know, there are communities that I'm more familiar with than others, but it is about wherever we have the disaster of making sure that we have been in that community, that people know us, that we know them, because all communities have to be made whole for the whole community to be able to be sustainable. And so one of the lessons I would say that we learned after Hurricane Matthew in 2016 was that we needed to build an infrastructure through the 41 counties that we think of as Eastern North Carolina. And so we have probably about 200 churches that we work with that specifically work around 5 areas. And so one of those areas is food access. You know, there was a statistic at one point that one of our congressional districts that we serve in Eastern North Carolina was the 4th poorest and the 2nd hungriest in the nation. So food is always an issue. When we think about that, the statistic from our food bank is that there's never more than a 3-day supply of food. Food access is always important, especially if there is a structural issue with a disaster that causes there to be an interruption in the infrastructure of getting food in. The other thing, this is like our own FEMA project, because communities have to be empowered to work and serve. It's a partnership. So I have to bring something to the table. And so we really work to empower communities in this way. Educational recovery, employment opportunities, and economic empowerment are important. That's the E of the FEMA, because we want communities, they always say, where's FEMA? FEMA has, well, what do we do in the community to build this infrastructure of resiliency? Mental health supports and access to affordable housing and access to affordable healthcare. These are all areas that we have seen drastically impacted even in the last 18 months of COVID-19. And so what we recognize is that it is important that in blue skies, even though I like how was said earlier, it's raining, we still need to do this work because we are trying to be stable towards sustainability. And so the second thing that we've learned is that we must work to build these partnerships in blue skies to really support recovery and resiliency. Back in 2011, when Hurricane Irene devastated our community, I went on to serve as the founding chair for our long-term recovery coalition. And we had a lot of folks that were non-compliant with FEMA. They had insurance at one time, they gotten help through FEMA, but then became non-compliant because they weren't able to hold it. We have a large commercial fishermen population. And so there were these challenges. And so how are we gonna rebuild these homes? We don't want people to leave Pamlico County. This is home. You know, you want people to stay in Union. You want them to stay in Mecklenburg. But how do we do this? And so we partnered with a national organization called 8 Days of Hope. But we were going to bring these people in, almost 2,000 volunteers. How are we going to do that? Where are they going to stay? We don't have hotels, and we have beautiful bed and breakfasts here, but not hotels. Where are they going to stay? So we partnered with Governor Perdue's office at that time. We partnered with our local camps. And so Camp Seafair, Camp Seagull were the places where people were able to stay. We filled the camps, so then we had to overflow to the community college. It took everybody to get almost $3 million worth of free work done in our communities so that we could build that resiliency. But it wasn't done by one person or one group. It took everybody. Building permits had to be done. So we had to work with local government. It comes together when we are able to work together. And so that's the power of that blue skies, even if it's rainy. It's hard to build relationships. It's hard to call emergency management during a storm. Even though they're working and they're doing all that great work, it's hard to say, oh, can we sit down for a cup of coffee? Okay, that's not the time to do that work. So this is the important time to be doing it now. And finally, it's critical to know and map communities for resiliency to be fully realized. And so when we talk about equity, whether or not it is low wealth, rural communities, communities of color, we have to look at the importance of the whole community being mapped. So a couple of years after Hurricane Irene, we participated in a 2-year project through SAMHSA. It's a multi-million-dollar grant that spanned multiple states. And our job was to really look at how do we build the ability for communities to, as we say, bounce back when we think about resiliency? How is that going to happen unless we build it now? And so we had to map our communities. We needed to know where the churches were, where are the daycares? Well, why would I map a daycare? Well, when Hurricane Florence hit New Bern I guess that's now been almost 3 years coming up on it, when we were devastated by Hurricane Florence and more than half of the home daycares were impacted and flooded, where were people going to take their children when it was time to go back to work to build our economic engine back? That was missing. And so what we recognized is that we have to really take a full approach of how do we really build the infrastructure to bounce back. And so that mapping piece is looking at each community and seeing what they have, what they need, and what they can bring to the table. And so these are the lessons that we're continuing to work through as we are dealing with the impacts of these hurricanes, still Hurricane Matthew, still Hurricane Florence, Hurricane Isaias, and now COVID-19. It is an ongoing process, but we have to continue to build these infrastructures of resiliency.
Thank you, Dawn. Now we're going to head to the next panelist, and I think you'll see that a lot of the messages build on each other.
Good morning, everybody. My name's Joe Stanton. I'm sitting right now in an EMS office in Haywood County. We just received the declaration yesterday, and we're starting the phase of recovery process with FEMA. I want to echo on a lot of the comments that have been made. They're excellent comments that we can take and build on, of resiliency and meeting people where they are and working together. Those are things that we all need to focus on. And I want to take those and also add some basically some cliches that we all have looked at, but just maybe expand a little bit on those. The first one is to take ownership of the recovery phase. You know, we need to manage by objective in recovery and not the processes. Sometimes we get hung up so much in the process of recovery. We need to focus on how your community needs are, and also what your community wants, how they want to recover. Don't just focus on the processes of the organizations of FEMA, PA, IA. I think it was mentioned that what would we do if they weren't here? We've got to be able to focus on at the end. And in that, we need to, totally begin as much as we can with the end in mind. An example of this is some of the housing programs. With many of the housing programs, the process is to focus on different phases of housing, and they are needed. So, but unfortunately, we spend a tremendous amount of time on temporary and transitional programs. So by the time permanent housing comes around, there's some gaps there that have to be met. For example, Laura mentioned, at the very beginning, FEMA doles out a certain amount of money, and we expect those individuals 3 years later or 2 years later, when we're getting ready to go into the permanent housing piece, that they'll still have the money, which is unrealistic. So we need to find ways, and Laura brought out one way of a solution to that. We need to focus on how are we going to move into the permanent phase. We are going to have to do temporary housing. We are going to have to do transitional housing, but how are we going to move into permanent housing? And this has got to be done at the beginning. You just can't wait till that part of the process begins to think about it. It's got to be thought out at the very time of the disaster. How are we going to take this phase into this phase into this phase? And also work with individuals to understand their recovery housing programs and bring the community together and ask them, how do you want this to look like? What do you want this to look like? And the next one is to have recovery leadership at your EOC during activation. I know this is long-term, but this is the beginning. You begin long-term recovery actually during the phase of planning for recovery, the process. And so long-term recovery begins, and you should have somebody at the EOC focusing on recovery. This begins the coordination. To do it correctly at the beginning saves time at the end. It's important to start recovery planning as early as possible, identify damage areas, planning for housing, debris collection, helping with the public information officer, answering questions. You'd be surprised 3 years later, when you're in long-term, or 4 years later, when you're in long-term recovery, some of the citizens are asking the same questions that were asked 3 years before because we didn't communicate correctly. We need this person at the EOC, and I really believe this is an important thing, doesn't need to be in response. You can't have somebody that is working in emergency management for EMS, or somebody that has multiple tasks and this assign them recovery. It doesn't work like that. It's not going to be successful. You need to have somebody different at your EOC, just totally focused on recovery. The second bullet that I have deals with communications and partnerships. This is everything. This will make or break your recovery, short-term, intermediate, and long-term recovery. Communicate. First of all, at the beginning, communicate your success stories. Recovery is different than response. Sometimes in response, we can tell actual physical things of what's going on. We rescued this number of people. We did this, and you can show that. But in recovery, the people in recovery sometimes don't feel that, because recovery is a much longer process. So we need to talk about the success stories, such as moving housing, moving people around, moving people back to permanent housing, people that have homes were damaged. And as they move, we need to tell the community the success, and also what are some of the issues. You must always in recovery have dialogue. Dialogue is crucial to successful recovery. Partnerships make or break recovery. You cannot recover in isolation. That means as a form of government, you must work with public, private, secular, all different organizations must come to the table. A lot of questions have got to be asked and a lot of dialogue has got to take place. Also, pay attention to your hotline. You set up these hotlines for citizens and communities to call in, but we don't build on them sometimes. We just, well, we got this many calls and this and this many calls and that. It's an excellent tool to begin focusing on what your recovery needs are going to be in the long term. The next bullet, or the last bullet, is really it's pretty simple, and it deals also a lot with long-term recovery. Don't let the initial recovery phase become a disaster in itself. Recovery has a tendency to do that because we don't focus on the end. We focus on the phases. With project management, we need to have timelines on and stick to them. The thing about recovery is time flies in recovery for the people that are doing recovery. It does not fly for the citizens and the people that have been impacted. We need to set more goals and work towards those goals. Also dealing with infrastructure and large projects. At the time of the disaster, when you have a large project that has been damaged, put together a project management type approach, not a project necessarily just a project worksheet, but look at a project management approach that's going to solve the problem, bring everybody to the table to work together to an equitable solution that you're going to work for. Now, FEMA may just be a small part of that, but don't let that process of the project worksheet drive what your intentions are. We have many examples where we didn't stay focused on some of these projects, and even from Matthew, we're still at the beginning phase of almost creating these projects for the third or fourth or fifth time. There are communities that have been impacted in Matthew and before events that we're still working with the initial projects to get things through. We did not stay focused. We did not put the projects together. And so I beg you, when there is a large project, which is usually over a certain amount, where you have infrastructure damage, that's kind of complicated. Focus on project management, not just on the project worksheet.
And Joe, I appreciate and thank you for all of the information. We're going to have just a little time for Jane and Amanda to jump in, and then if time allows, we'll take additional questions. As I noted earlier, if your question doesn't get answered, please feel free to put it in the chat, and we can work on providing answers as a follow-up as well if there's a large number of them that we don't get to. So thank you, Joe. I appreciate it. All right. If you can cover yours, I appreciate it.
Sure. Good morning, everyone, from Joplin, Missouri, in the middle of the country where it is a sunny day. I want to talk for just a minute from the community perspective with some lessons that I've seen and learned from my experience in Joplin, because please understand, I'm not an elected official. I was never professionally employed, but I was always a volunteer in recovery. And so I think of these three lessons from the community perspective. Joe's great lesson that recovery has to begin really the day after the disaster is a very true one. And so I said, all three of my things have to do with time. And that is that recovery and response coexist in time. And the reason that's important from the community perspective is in the early days, you have the opportunity to take advantage of a tremendous amount of community goodwill, where everyone in the community is working together and they're willing to put aside personal gain for community goals. So if you want them to get involved in recovery, if you want them to do things, ask early, ask why they're feeling this huge sense of community pride and the fact that we can recover from this. If you'll grab them early on, I think you'll find that there's a lot they'll do for you. It certainly worked for me. My second one is that you should take time to mark progress all along recovery. You heard Joe say that, you know, in the response phase, we saved this many lives, the road is open, the bridge is clear again. In long-term recovery, it gets harder and harder to mark progress as you go. You know, we had easy things to mark in the beginning when we removed debris, when school opened on time. Those were easy ones to mark, but then we found we needed to mark progress by saying, here's the day that we rebuilt the high school and we reopened it. We needed to mark that day because times went longer and longer and people would forget we were still in recovery mode. So think about it. For us, frankly, when Chick-fil-A opened again in Joplin after it had been destroyed, you would have thought it was the second coming because so many people were excited about that landmark. So figure out what's important to the community and make sure that you're marking that so they can see progress after debris has been cleared and after roads have been cleared, that things are still happening. And really, third, I have a thing when I speak sometimes called the time warp of recovery. I can tell you that in Joplin, everyone thinks that whatever happened, they date from May 22nd, 2011, the day the tornado happened. Well, because I'm in a crowd of people who speak government, I'll speak government. You know, we didn't get our CDBG-DR money, the first assessment, until almost a year after that, and it was about 45 million. Then we got our Hurricane Sandy guilt money about 2 years later, and that was another $112 million. So you know what, everyone thought, well, gosh, it's been 2 years since the tornado. Why hasn't anything happened? You have to communicate to community members the long cycle of long-term recovery, that it's going to take a while to, number one, get the money, 2 years or better, maybe 3 from HUD. Then you're going to have to figure out how to spend it. So you're going to have to go through federal procurement, and you're going to have to go through brownfield assessments. You're going to have to go through all the pieces that it takes to develop a project, and the tremendous amount of pressure your community will feel by getting this money that you believe will only come once. And if it comes once, you want to spend it correctly. And so there's a lot of pressure around that. And people wonder why in the world we aren't recovered when it's been 3 years or 4 years. So help them through great communication to understand the process of recovery. In Joplin, we just finished spending our CDBG-DR money in 2019. So think about that, or 2020. 9 years later, we're still finishing spending our money that's had to do with recovery. And I'm astounded that people would go, gosh, why is this road closed again? Why are we always tearing something up, when they don't remember that it was really the tornado that gave us the opportunity to build back better. So with those in mind, Lee, I think I'll turn it on over to Amanda.
Thank you, Jane. We appreciate it. And Amanda, I know that we're running a little short on time, so I appreciate that we may run quickly through yours. So thank you.
Sure. So my name is Amanda Martin. I'm the state's Chief Resilience Officer. I work at the North Carolina Office of Recovery and Resiliency for Laura Hogshead. And my role in the state is to think a little bit bigger picture about resilience. And so I think given the fantastic panel of speakers that we have and how knowledgeable they are, I'm going to move quickly through my comments because I probably have fewer of those fantastic specific insights that we've been hearing from other panelists. I like to start out with a kind of concept of resilience and why it's intertwined with recovery. I won't labor over a definition of resilience, but sometimes I like to use this metaphor, and bear with me if you've heard me use it before, but sometimes I talk about if this was in person, if we were at a conference hall and you're standing next to a door with your conference coffee in this hand and your conference pastry in this hand, chatting with someone that you haven't seen for a while, and the door swings open. And, hopefully you don't spill your coffee or spill it onto your colleague or anything. But maybe the door runs into you and you kind of stumble and you recapture your posture, you recollect your coffee, but you don't go back and stand exactly where you were standing before, right? You take one step over so that you're no longer in the way of the heavy door swinging open. And that's what we talk about with resilience. It's not always about bouncing back. And I think that can be a really big kind of recovery phrase, but we like to talk about bouncing forward. Where do we want to go? The second major point I wanted to make, and this is something that all of our speakers have talked about, is building those relationships, especially building them before disaster strikes. So much of our recovery work is predicated on existing relationships. It's about who you know to speak with, who you know to get information from, how does that two-way conversation happen, everything from long-term housing recovery to short-term immediate food and water drops. And I think this is particularly important for the equity piece because there are long-standing historical reasons that low-income communities and communities of color especially may have some distrust for government officials. And it may take twice as much work to really build those relationships and go out and put in the effort before disaster, if possible, and also after disaster to build and strengthen those relationships so that we are making sure that we serve people equitably and we serve those who are hit hardest. My final point is to know what you want to fund and know what you want to fund before disaster strikes. And this is sort of idealistic, and I don't mean to say you would have very specific outlines of different projects in mind, but have a picture in your head. If disaster happened, where would we want to spend the money and how might we want to rebuild differently? And how would a program work and who would be our partners? Because resources do come in after disaster. And if it's a federally declared disaster, you'll have federal resources. If it's a smaller disaster, you will still have you'll have philanthropic resources, you'll have individual donations, you'll have other kinds of resources like volunteer labor, media attention. And so being able to think ahead of time about how to spend those resources to meet your community's needs will be a huge advantage in terms of being able to effectively deploy resources that come in during disaster. One of the challenging aspects of disaster is that we've heard a lot about I like the time warp phrase or the setting expectations about how long disaster resources can take to actually be deployed and turn into tangible things on the ground. But the other side of that is some decisions have to be made very quickly and within certain timeframes. And there isn't always time for a deliberative process to make decisions. And so having some of that deliberation and thought and discussion happen beforehand can help ensure that when disaster resources come in, they're spent in the wisest ways possible. So I'll limit my comments to that.
Thank you, Amanda. So based on the timeline, I'm going to focus in on one question, and then I'm going to kind of drive around the room quickly and try to get a response from each of you. So again, we want to hone in on one thing. You've given us a lot of great information, but I'm curious about if there are any innovative recovery strategies that you think you've seen in your experience and that you'd like to share with the group. I'm going to start off and go the other way. So Amanda, if you don't mind, I'll put you right back on to kind of think about any innovative strategies you've seen.
I think some of the most innovative strategies that we see sometimes come from outside of government. And we see really, and that's kind of, I am a public servant, lifelong career in government. But some of the most innovative response and recovery pieces we sometimes see from places that are maybe not being served in the way that they need, and they look at themselves and see, well, we have this resource and I'm a leader and I can organize this effort. And so I think just looking outside of government sometimes to see the innovation and then be able to come in and offer support and say, I see this fantastic thing you're doing. How can we support you? Could we support you in replicating it? Could we offer resources? So really looking around and seeing that sometimes the most nimble actors are those that aren't in the public sector and supporting them.
Great, thank you. That's a great point. And again, we're just going to do these quick about 1-minute responses. Again, for Jane, I'll just note it again if you've seen any innovative recovery strategies that you'd like to share.
I think I want to call out just one specific example from Joplin and how we were able to spend our CDBG DR money. We had to repopulate an area that was completely clean, scrubbed to the ground. And to try to get people to build houses back in that area, which is very different from the floodplain cycle, where sometimes you want to get people out. We wanted people back. And so we used a portion of the CDBG DR money to incent home ownership for people who had never been able to be a homeowner. So we took an amount that they were able to get and use as equity, as kind of an equity share in that payment. So if they agreed to build in that area and stayed in their house for a certain number of years, they were forgiven a portion of their loan. So think about that as a way that you can spend that money, because when Laura said earlier, when you've heard that someone else has done it successfully in another community, but you don't know if it would work for you, you can use our example as a way to help get houses rebuilt by using some of that money to make people first-time homeowners. So there's my quick one.
Awesome, thank you, Jane. All right, to pivot over to Joe, if you have a short answer again about innovative strategies for recovery.
I think innovative strategies, I think of partnerships. I think Amanda said a lot about non-governmental partnerships. We've been able to once in a while partner with between federal, state, county, and actually nonprofits to actually have the nonprofit take the lead. I think those are when we're able to do that. We've done this in some housing aspects. When we're able to bring everybody to the table, I think we can come up with more innovative strategies, and certainly working with different nonprofits as they develop strategies for in particular disasters. And that's it.
Thank you, Joe. And then lastly, over to Dawn again to wrap up on this topic, any innovative strategies.
So after Hurricane Matthew, we realized that there was a need for getting information to people in a timely manner of things that were resources that were in their communities. And so being able to develop a forum online. So we have the Eastern North Carolina Disaster Resources page. We have about 6,000, 7,000 people that are on that page even now, where we're able to get information out that might be coming from emergency management that they're trying to push out to the community. And literally what happened during Hurricane Florence is when the phone systems were absolutely overwhelmed, people then got on that page and were able to say, this is where my family member is, please get a rescue to them. And so it literally became the lifeline of a community in a whole region.
Awesome, thank you so much. And I once again want to thank all of the panelists for making the time to share your experiences and expertise with us. Really appreciate it. You've added a large amount of value to this experience for all of us. And if you're available, they may be pivoting into some of the breakout groups that we're going to pivot to next. So you might see some of these faces again. So I appreciate your time and thank you for the insights.
Okay, so as Lee mentioned, we're going to use the rest of our time today for small group discussions. And just the objectives of what these discussions are about is that we've heard a lot from our speakers and our panelists, a lot of great information, and we want to think through how we might apply these learnings to potential disasters in the future. We also want to expand our partnerships. As we mentioned, we hope that in these groups you're able to engage with organizations or partners that you may not have met before, or strengthen those relationships. And then finally, we want to explore some key focus areas. So do a bit of a deeper dive in the 4 areas that we asked you to select your greatest interest in when you registered. So again, this is just no fault, open discussion. We're all here to share and learn, and we encourage you to participate. So we have put a scenario together, but I want to preface to say that don't pay attention to the details. Don't get bogged down too much in the scenario. This is really just to provide that frame of reference for our discussion, so you have something to talk through. And you'll get more details when we divide up into our breakout groups. Your facilitators will be there to walk you through stuff. But just to give you an overview of what we're thinking in terms of what the scenario that we're working towards is. So we're going to work, we're going to think through a disaster that happens tomorrow. So we've had historic summer rainfall. Our watersheds are close to flood stage. In this scenario, we have severe thunderstorms that move through our region, and they cause tornado outbreaks. We have heavy rains and significant flooding. And then on top of that, there's an excessive heat wave, so that people that have lost power are dealing with the heat wave as well. And all of this is on top of our current situation with COVID. So when we think of the immediate impacts of a disaster this size, it's going to damage hundreds of houses, businesses and industries, schools, hospitals, and major roads. We might be without power, water, internet, and there's going to be a lot of heavy debris. So again, I rushed through that, I know, but you're going to get more information in your breakout groups. So we're going to have 4 breakout groups. One discussing whole community recovery and how to coordinate and partner with different organizations. One focused on disaster housing solutions. One focused on economic and small business recovery. And our last one will focus on infrastructure systems. So Connor, who is our Zoom master, is going to put you in your pre-selected breakout groups now. You don't have to do anything. And you'll find yourselves there, and your facilitators will walk you through the activity. So we'll see you there.
So hello, Star Trek travelers through our breakout rooms and ability to virtually social network. And we've come almost to the end of our journey today on this long-term recovery planning. And I'm interested in listening to this recording and listening to the notes and the slides and sharing all as we move forward into the next upcoming workshops. We have them planned for October 12th, which will be a recovery planning workshop, and November 16th, which is an equity-focused recovery workshop. They'll be led by our partner IEM, Meg and Lee. And we also will be showcasing a GIS, a Geographic Information Spatial Equity themed interface that's looking at vulnerability and equity as part of that November 16th workshop. So as I said, today's recordings and slides will be emailed to all registrants. And I want to thank everybody for hanging in here to the end. I know moving around and different things, there are so many other things that we can pay attention to, but thank you for paying attention to today. And I think if anything, we learned that partnerships and listening and collaboration are really key to long-term recovery. So I'll turn it over to Geraldine. Thank you.
Yeah, I just want to add my thank you to each and every one of you. I know you are very busy, especially our emergency managers and some of our elected officials that I saw on the call today. And it's hard to kind of tune in and concentrate and take away some things, but we hope it's been worthwhile for you. We're really excited to be on this journey of regional collaboration to help us prepare for and better respond in a resilient way to any future disruptions that we might encounter as a region. So today has been really informative. There's lots of really great work to come. Centralina remains committed to this issue and committing to building on the strong partnerships that already exist in our region and supporting each of our counties and community wade through these issues and think about how we can work together in productive and collaborative ways. So thanks for tuning in. You'll be hearing more from our team, and we hope you have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Thank you.